Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our third intermediate asset management training session today on criticality. This is the third of 4 online training sessions that we are hosting for small water systems in Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Maryland, and Wisconsin as part of our Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. Before we get started, there are a few logistical items to cover. So during the training today, everyone will be kept on mute just to ensure audio quality. I'm sure you're all very used to that by now. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session, and we will queue it up to be asked to the presenter. We will also send you a link to a follow-up email that has a recording attached to it. And additionally, if you're interested in viewing the slides from today's presentation, you can download a copy of them under the handout section. We do have some stricter attendance policies in place for this training series due to the requirements of the states that we are working with. This training is approved for 1.5 hours by Wisconsin DNR. It is pending Pennsylvania DEP, and it is approved by the Maryland Department of Environment. So please listen closely if you require a certificate of attendance or water or wastewater credit in these states. We are asking everyone to fully participate and will be tracking your participation in compliance with our state partners. The requirements are listed on the slide here. Please note we need you to participate in the polling questions every 15 minutes. Some of the polling questions will be a quiz style, but this is just to prepare you for the short 10-question quiz that you will need to fill out upon completion of this training. It doesn't matter if you answer the questions incorrectly when they are in the polls, but you will need a passing grade of about 50% or higher when you take your quiz. The quiz will pop up in your browser once this training concludes. You will also see a link in our follow-up email that will go out today at about 3:30, and you must contact us if you have any difficulty taking the quiz or answering poll questions. It shows up in the email as to take the survey, and then it has the name of the training. Please let us know as soon as possible if you encounter any issues so we can address them and accommodate you right away. We will be reporting our rosters within the next 10 days, and we cannot make adjustments once we submit. Lastly, if you have an operator or ID number in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Maryland, and you did not provide it when registering, please type it into the questions box along with your state. And I'm just checking now to see if anyone had any questions about that, and it looks like we are all set. Now that we've covered the requirements, here is a little bit of information about the Environmental Finance Center Network. Our program provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Haley Hajik from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at the University of New Mexico to get us started on the training. So welcome, Haley. I am passing off presentation mode to you.
Okay. All right, let me just put this in full screen. Okay, can you see my screen, Tess?
It looks great.
Great, thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for coming today. We really appreciate you being here. And I want to just take a couple of minutes to let you know a little bit more about us at the Southwest EFC, and then we'll dive right into the training, right into asset management. For those of you who've joined us in the last 2 sessions of this series, so last week and the week before, the next 5 minutes will probably sound pretty familiar to you, but for folks who are new, we just want to keep everyone up to speed. As Tess mentioned, I'm part of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and we a pretty multidisciplinary team with engineering, water resources, teaching, even some computer programming, GIS, accounting, and a couple other backgrounds. And we are part of the University of New Mexico, which is located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it's pretty warm here, and I apologize, I'm a little bit stuffy because of spring allergies, so bear with me. But our mission statement, as you can see on the slide here, is in the center. It's the Southwest EFC promotes self-reliance through innovative training and assistance focused on actionable results. And that's really our goal, developing capacity and self-reliance within utilities. It's the classic teach a man how to fish approach rather than fishing for them. And so that's what we're hoping to do with this series on intermediate asset management. If you were on my coworkers Dawn's level of service presentation 2 weeks ago, you'll know how important a mission statement is to any organization or any utility. So that's ours. But a little bit more about me. I have been with the EFC for about 2.5 years now, and my background is in water resources and environmental science. And at the EFC here, I do mostly asset management and partnership trainings, as well as technical assistance. And if you were on our webinar last week, you had James, who had this really cool picture guitar that he was building. And sadly, I'm not as handy, so I don't have this homemade guitar picture, but instead I thought I would share a picture of me with a rare body of water in New Mexico. This is Abiquiu Reservoir up in northern New Mexico, and it's actually really close to where Georgia O'Keeffe's ranch is, where she did a lot of her paintings, if there's any art lovers on. But I promise not all of New Mexico is that brown, but this is one of our rare bodies of water. So finally, as Tess mentioned, please go ahead and type in any questions that you might have. Dawn is on with us, so she'll either interrupt me with your question if she feels like it's best that we go over it in the moment, or she'll save them to the end and ask me at the end. Again, please participate in the polls. These ones are not hard. They're mostly questions about your system, so yes or no answers, but we just need your participation so we can show the state folks that everyone was engaged. All right, so with that, let's go into a brief overview of asset management to know where criticality fits within the whole. The first is, what is asset management? What's the technical definition? Well, we like to say that asset management is providing the desired level of service at the lowest life cycle cost. And those are some asset management buzzwords. John went over level of service 2 weeks ago, and if you're on the webinar next week, you're going to find out a lot more about life cycle costing. But when we say desired level of service, that's what you want your assets to provide. And then at the lowest life cycle costs means the best appropriate cost. So you're really thinking through what you would like your assets to provide and if you can provide it at a reasonable price. And there are 5 components to asset management that covers 5 important questions. The first being, what service level do you want to provide to your customers? What assets do you have? So inventory. Which ones are most important or most critical to provide that service level that you're looking to provide? That's what we're going to go over today. How do you ensure the assets do their job over their lifespan? And then finally, what do you have the money to get it all done? So it's about the money. And so we like to then convert these into the basic 5 core components: level of service, current state of the assets, criticality, which is what we'll go over today, life cycle costing, that'll be next week, and funding. And we don't do long-term funding in this series just because it's very state and system specific. And since we have people from different states, we thought it'd be better to focus on the other 4 components. And so thus far, I've shown you asset management components in this linear manner in the last 2 slides, but it's not a process that you go through once and stop, and you don't have to start at level of service and end with long-term funding. It's an approach for running utilities over an extended period of time, and it doesn't have a beginning or an end. It's an ongoing process. It doesn't have a stopping or a starting point. You can use what you already know about your assets and build from there. And of course, you can't change the past or how things were run in the past, but you can use those experiences that you've gained as learning opportunities and apply them to various asset management principles. So that's why we also like to show it in this circular format. You can pick any component to start with. We suggest level of service because those are your goals, and that's a great foundation for you to start with. It's also a lot easier than maybe starting with life cycle costing because you have to know a lot more about your assets. But again, no right or wrong way to start. You can start at any point. And finally, our kind of buzz phrase that we always like to tell people is that asset management is a journey. It's not a destination. Once you've established some asset management practices, it's a lot easier to continue to grow that process and build off of that foundation that you created. And while there are computer programs out there, CMMS systems and others that will help you with asset management, they can't do it for you. You still have to be in charge of decisions and decide how they are made. And it'll be an ongoing process, but the idea is that the processes you set up for your system with asset management will help make your life easier and um, will help you serve your customers better in the future. So with that, we're going to try out our first poll here just to get everyone ready and familiar with how polling works. So Tess, if you can pull up the poll. I can't see it, so I just need you to let me know when you feel like people have answered. But the question is, do you rank your assets? And by that, I mean, is there any way in your system that you organize your assets based on how critical they are, or which ones are more at risk of failing, or which one are more important? So that's a yes or no question, or for those of you who are not working for a system, maybe you're a consultant, you can select not applicable.
Great. And Haley, we are having folks complete the poll. We had it open for about 45 seconds, and we'll let people have just a few more seconds to get your response in.
Okay.
And again, remember that we're looking for full participation in polls from anyone who would be interested in any type of certificate of attendance. So it looks like we have full participation, so I'm going to close it.
Awesome.
And as far as our results, we have the majority of people saying no. About 40% said no. 28% said yes, and then about 33% said not applicable.
Okay, perfect. Well, then that's great because Criticality is going to go more in depth about how to rank your assets. So for those of you who said no, maybe this will give you some ideas of how you could do it in the future, if it'll be helpful to you. And then for those who said yes, maybe it'll help you even make that process better. So thank you, Tess. Okay. With that, let's get right into criticality. Again, it is the third component to asset management, and criticality is the measure of risk associated with an asset. And criticality is not a word often used unless you're in the asset management world. So a good way to remember what criticality is to associate it with risk. You can usually replace criticality with the word risk and still get similar meaning. So not all assets are equally important within your system. Some of your assets are going to be highly critical to achieving those level of service goals, and others are going to be much less critical. And so what you'll want to do is minimize the risk that's associated with those highly critical assets before you put in more time or more resources into those less critical assets. And this is what we're going to explore today that will hopefully help you do that. As I'm sure many of you have experienced, if you've ever worked for a system, there are many areas within your system that could use upgrading, that could use rehabbing or replacement, but unfortunately, of course, there isn't enough funding for everything that you'd like to do. So to determine where your limited funding should go, first you're going to need to think about which assets are the most critical to sustaining your operations. And you can do this by determining which assets are most likely to fail and also what are the consequences if those assets do fail. And we're going to go over those two components much more in depth soon. But as I mentioned in the last slide, not all of your assets are created equal, and there are assets that you're going to need to sustain your operations more than other. And this is where criticality comes in. It's going to help you prioritize those assets based on risk. So the main objective for this section is what I want you to take away is that projects and activities should be prioritized based on criticality, or you could, insert risk, to ensure limited financial and personnel resources are used efficiently. And there are two main components to criticality. So you'll see on the screen here two pictures. On the left, pretty clear, you have pipes that are in fairly good condition. But then on the right, I want to give you some context to this picture. So this was Houston in February of 2020. I don't know if you remember, but it made the news. A 96-inch water main broke and it completely flooded major highways, several roadways, and it even caused the state's largest school district, along with local colleges, polling places, a bunch of businesses to close. And the flooding caused about 12 to 15 cars on the roads to become trapped. And this pipe additionally was connected to a plant that supplies nearly 50% of the city's water. So a lot of issues going on, and it ultimately turned out that there were days-long boil water advisories for many parts of the cities. And after all was said and done, they blamed it on aging infrastructure. So obviously a pretty big consequence occurred because of this aging infrastructure. And that brings us to the two components that you'll want to consider when we're talking about criticality. And that's your probability of failure and consequence of failure. So the left-hand picture, you have these pipes that are in pretty good condition, so they don't seem very likely to fail. And failure is important when you're considering risk, of course, but that's not the only component that you need to think about. You also need to consider the consequences if something were to happen to that asset, like the flooding, like the boil water advisory, like those folks who were not able to go to work for a couple days. So to determine which of your assets are most critical, the two questions that you need to answer are how likely your asset is to fail. That's that probability of failure. And then what are the consequences if your asset does fail? And that's the consequence of failure. And I'm going to go in depth with both, but we'll start first with probability of failure. This is the first step in determining the criticality of your asset, and it's of course unrealistic and basically impossible to entirely eliminate the possibility of failure. Because once you put an asset into operation, then its condition ultimately will slowly deteriorate over time. And while you can improve it with maintenance, rehabilitation, it's ultimately going to perform best when you first put that asset into operation. So all you can do is work to minimize any kind of failure, especially for those assets that have high consequences of failure, like that main break in Houston. And there are 4 modes of failure that you should consider when thinking about your assets. And each of these failure modes have a variety of factors that contribute to that potential failure mode, ranging from, say, maybe the O&M history of an asset, or the customer expectations, or the condition of your assets. And there's no one factor that is the most common cause of any kind of failure. All 4 mechanisms all four modes of failure should be considered when you're thinking about POF, your probability of failure. But the four modes are on the screen. So we have mortality, level of service, capacity failure, and financial inefficiency. And mortality is definitely the most common type that people think of when they think of asset failure. This is when something physical happens to the asset and it fails due to a physical problem. And this can occur due to natural deterioration of an asset over time, or it can be sudden and unpredictable, such as an asset being run over by a car, which I hear happens very often to hydrants from many operators. So that would be your mortality failure. Other mortality failures would be stuck valves or leaks. Those would all fall under that mode of failure. Then we have a level of service failure, and these occur because of changes in regulations or changes in customer demands or desires. This is when your asset is still operational, but it's unable to meet the level of service that's required. So something physical does not have to happen to the asset like it does for mortality for a level of service failure to occur. An example of this kind of failure would be customers, say your customers want fire flow, but they currently have a 4-inch pipe. So you may be replacing a perfectly good 4-inch pipe with a 6-inch pipe to accommodate that request from your customers because you need a 6-inch pipe for fire flow. Again, no mortality failure. The pipe is completely fine. It just can't provide the level of service that your customers want. Next, we have capacity. And capacity failures occur when an asset is not able to deliver something like the flow that you want. So the pipe could be in decent shape. Again, no mortality, but it's just not delivering that flow you need. And assets may experience capacity failure even earlier on due to improper planning or improper design. And then finally, we have this financial inefficiency. This is when your costs of operation and maintenance activities, along with additional costs like repairs, are looked at an individual asset basis, and then it's determined that there's a point at which it no longer makes economic sense to keep that asset in service. There's a point when it's actually cheaper to replace the asset than it would be to continue to operate it and maintain it, because you're just pouring money into it because you're fixing it so often, for example, then you're just going to want to replace it. And that's when you hit that financial inefficiency. This one can be a bit tricky because to make a valid determination, you need some data over an extended period of time. For systems that are just beginning with asset management, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to have that level of detailed historical data on O&M. So especially on an individual basis. So it may take some time for your program to mature and be put in place before you can determine if there's any financial inefficiency, or maybe you know there is, but you don't have the numbers to back it up, which are usually necessary when you're talking to your stakeholders. So those are your four modes of failure, and there are many factors that impact all of those modes of failure in different ways. You see some of them on the screen. These are by no means all of the factors that impact failure, but we find that these are the most common. So condition, obviously an asset's condition is going to deteriorate over time. As it deteriorates, it's going to be more likely to fail. And therefore, it's important to make the best possible attempt to give assets a reasonable condition assessment and update that annually if possible. Obviously, assets with better condition ratings are going to be less likely to fail than those with lower condition ratings. And James touched on condition ratings last week and has a great handout that shows an example condition rating system. If anyone's interested in that, please type it into the chat and I'm happy to send it to you after this presentation. Then we have remaining useful life, and we like to say remaining useful life rather than age because there's no magic age at which an asset can be expected to fail. For example, you might have a cast iron pipe in the ground that it was installed properly, made with good manufacturing techniques, and doesn't have any kind of history of failure. So even if it's 75 years old or older, it doesn't necessarily have a high probability of failure all of because of the good manufacturing or because of the history of no breaks. So instead of looking at age, look at remaining useful life and base it off of the information that you were able to gather over that asset's life. You should also look at historical data. That'll help you with remaining useful life, but on its own, historical data is any past information regarding the asset which might have prevented it from performing its function. So that would be if you had knowledge of a poor design or poor construction or manufacturing processes used at the time that it was installed, or if there was inadequate material. Those would all be historical, that would all be historical information that you would want to look at when it comes to failure. Then we get to repair history. You should definitely be tracking your repair history of your assets, including when and where the repair occurred and also why it was needed. Keep that information as specific as possible so that staff coming in or anyone helping you can understand why that failure happened. Or say in 10 years, if you're not working there anymore, then people have that record and they can probably interpret future failures better. Past failure, of course, is not completely predictive of future failure, but it can be a really good indication of some probability of future failure. So repair history is really important. And then finally, we have O&M history. Knowledge of how the asset was operated and maintained will provide good information about how likely it is to fail. The lack of adequate maintenance is likely to shorten an asset's useful life and cause premature failure. I think everybody is aware of that. So keeping that information is crucial. Also, note if the asset is subject to harsh conditions like frequent starts and stops, or if it's operating outside of its design specification. That would also be information that you would like to note. So again, these are not an exhaustive list of factors, but they're some of the most common. And of course, they're going to vary depending on the type of asset you're looking at. So whether it's a pipe or whether it's a valve or whether it's a meter. But after considering all of these factors that would cause failure, you're then going to want to give that asset a probability of failure rating. Usually we do 1 to 5. But before we get into that, it's time for another poll question. So I think that this one will look pretty similar to the first one, but this is diving a little bit deeper. So for those of you who work for a system, do you have any way of ranking the probability of failure of your assets?
Just going to chime in quickly to let you know, Haley, that we have about 60% of folks submitting a response so far. And again, yeah, we're looking for some full participation from the people who are interested in continuing education, documentation for this. I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, and 1. And as far as our results, majority of folks, 65%, said no, they do not currently have a POF ranking system. It wasn't applicable to about 24%, but 12% do rank probability of failure currently. So that's cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Tess. Yeah, that's great. It's great if you can rank probability of failure because, especially for operators, you definitely have a general idea of probability of failure in your head, but that's really only helpful to you and nobody else. So it's great if you can have something on paper, and especially later in this presentation, I'll talk about how visually it can really help if you are going for funding or you're trying to explain issues to your stakeholders. So here on screen, we have a probability of failure ranking structure that's pretty simple. So for those of you who don't have one yet, you might consider using this one. It's very basic and generic and a great place to start. So to determine criticality of an asset, the probability of failure of that asset needs to be quantified, which is why we're ranking the probability of failure. Um, the one on screen you see is 1 through 5, so 1 being extremely low probability of failure, 5 being extremely high, and then you have your in-between average. So it's fairly generic, but that's okay when you're first starting out. You don't have to use a 1 through 5 scale. You could do a 1 to 10, but we do suggest that you keep it fairly small, because if you did something like 1 to 25, that would be a lot of detail. And also, is there really a big difference between, say, ranking something as 20 and then something else as 21 at that point? So we suggest keeping the scale relatively small. And if you're just starting out, you can keep the descriptions fairly broad so that they can apply to any assets in the system. And this rating system shouldn't be a long time intensive activity. We think with small systems, you should be able to complete this process by meeting maybe a few times for a few hours each. And what you'll do is take the rating system and you'll assign each asset a probability of failure rating based on how likely the asset is to fail. Something to note is that the assets should be ranked relative to each other, because the goal is to determine which of your assets are more likely to fail than others in your system. And an asset, so for example, how you would rank these assets, an asset that is nearing the end of its useful life, is in poor condition, has a long history of repairs, and a poor history of maintenance is highly likely to fail. So based on all of those factors, I would assign that asset a 5 on the scale that we have on the screen right now. So an extremely high probability of failure. On the other hand, if you had an asset that definitely had a long useful life left, didn't have any kind of repairs in its history, was still in good condition, and you performed routine and or preventative maintenance on it, then it's going to be unlikely to fail. You can go ahead and assign it a 1, that extremely low probability of failure. And it may be easier to assess all of your assets of a specific class at the same time for easy comparison. So for example, we like to tell people to start off with hydrants because you can see them easily. You generally know where they are. So if you wanted to, you could go around and rate all of your hydrants. And that way it's also easy to compare what a 4 for hydrant would be for all of the other hydrants, versus if you did, a couple hydrants a day for the next couple of weeks, then you might sort of forget in your head what a 4 looked like for a hydrant. And then once you've assigned all of your assets a rating, you're going to want to go back and review those results and see if they make sense. So this would be if you did do hydrants and did it over an extended period of time, you might want to go back and make sure that all of the 4s were actually 4s, that sort of example. So that's probability of failure rating. Now we're going to jump into consequence of failure, which is the second component of criticality that I mentioned. After you consider the consequence of failure, after you consider the likelihood of failure, then you're going to come and think about the consequences of if any of those assets fail. And consequences can be a bit tricky because they're usually a value judgment of financial, environmental, and social impacts that may occur if there is a failure. And these impacts can be valued differently by giving more weight to one consequence than another. So it's going to be system specific. Again, some areas might think that the environmental consequences are much greater, while others might think that the social consequences are much greater. And it's up to you and your system to weight them how you see. So if you have, for example, why a consequence would be important, if you have 2 assets fail at the same time and you have limited resources, and the consequences of those failures can help you determine which asset to fix first or where to allocate more resources. Or even before failure, if you're looking at where you should do the most O&M, look at what the highest consequence asset would be and focus your resources there. So for example, if you were a small water system and you had a water pipe that serves a few houses, it's not as important to your utility as a single pump that supplies the entire water system. Because if that single pump fails, then the whole town's going to be out of water. So you're going to want to first put your energy and resources to making sure that pump's in good condition before putting those resources towards the pipe, for example. And as I mentioned, there are three components to consequences that you can consider: financial, environmental, and social. And these are all the impacts that you're going to want to think about when you think about consequences. And asset management professionals refer to these three categories as the triple bottom line. And within each of these categories, there's several tangible and intangible factors that influence the consequences of failure of an asset. A lot of these impacts are pretty hard to monetize, but when you do have data available on any of these, you should try to monetize because that makes it easier to compare if possible. But it can be pretty difficult to blend these various consequences and decide a value to each one of them, because I'm sure some people are going to argue that the social consequences are going to matter more to them than the financial consequences, which might matter more to you. So that's why consequence can be kind of difficult. For example, if you are a system, you may have to pay direct costs related to an asset failure, like the cost of water loss or the costs associated with repairs, or you might have fines or property damage. Those you can all assign a monetary value to, so it's pretty easy to compare those. But there are also these indirect costs that may occur in the form of social consequences that are not easily quantified, like if a business can't open that day, or if there's customer interruptions, or you're experiencing traffic delays, or maybe your public reputation as a system is ruined. You can't really monetize those impacts or consequences. So that's what makes it a bit tricky. But when thinking about the consequences, definitely consider all three of these. Consider the triple bottom line when rating or trying to monetize the kind of consequences that might occur with your system. And so with that, we're going to do another poll. And this one is asking about these three consequences. So when an asset fails, what consequences or what costs are you most concerned about? Would that be the financial cost? Would it be the environmental costs? Or would it be the social cost? Okay, it looks like the poll is closed. Can you tell me the results, Tess?
Yes, we are at 39% for the financial cost, 22% for environmental cost, and 11% said the social cost.
Okay, and I think that's pretty common, especially if you're working for a utility, a financial costs, and then the environmental costs, because there are also environmental ramifications to environmental costs, would rank the highest. I think social costs, if you asked a customer, would probably be higher ranked for them than some of the other costs, though if it was impacting their rates, I'm sure financial would be up there. Okay, so I'm going to go more in depth now about the three types of costs and what to consider when you're making decisions about those consequences for a specific asset. So for financial costs, some of the ones that you'll want to consider are up on the screen here, starting with that repair replace costs. These can be pretty simple or they can be pretty extensive. Some failures may be so severe, some repairs may be so expensive that you're just not going to do it. Instead, you're going to replace the asset. that's part of that financial inefficiency failure mode. But the financial cost of the repair or replacement of the failed asset needs to be considered in whatever analysis you're doing for the consequence of failure. If the asset can be repaired easily and without a tremendous cost, then obviously it's a lower consequence. You're going to think of it less. If the cost of repair is higher, then the consequences of failure are much greater. An example of this would be a small leak in a pipe can be pretty easily repaired with a clamp. So you might say consequence pretty low. A chlorine pump can be replaced with a spare pump if you have one, or perhaps the parts can be replaced inside that pump, and if they're readily available, again, not a huge deal, but a failure of a well may be much more involved, especially if other water sources are limited, and it's probably going to require much more extensive repair efforts. That would be a high cost. So if you're looking at all three of those assets, you're going to be most worried about that well when it comes to consequences. Uh, Next, we have legal fees. Individuals or businesses can sue a system for damages related to harm to property, any kind of injuries that may be sustained because of a failure, and also for revenue lost due to a failure. So if they can't open for a while. So for example, say someone is driving down the road and his car falls into a sinkhole that was caused by a water main failure or water line failure, and that driver sustains injuries. That driver may sue the system to not only cover the costs of those injuries, but also the cost of lost work time that might be associated with injuries. And if that sinkhole causes any damages to the surrounding businesses, they might also sue. There could be environmental damage from this sinkhole. Somebody else could sue. So these are all issues that you'll want to think about when it comes to legal fees and potential consequences. Damage to other assets, that's when an asset fails and damage is caused to potentially other assets in your system or other assets for other people. So we kind of covered that with the legal fees. Potentially your sinkhole could cause damages to a business. And then finally, having to pay customers or businesses that are damaged. Same thing, you could be held responsible for any kind of collateral damage related to a failure that impacts customers or businesses. So those are some financial costs that you should consider when determining the consequences of failure. Next, we have environmental costs. Again, you'll see some of them listed there. Some types of asset failures will lead to a variety of these environmental consequences. Any abrupt or significant change in water quantity and quality can lead to negative environmental impacts. And so environmental consequences might include contamination of waterways or land, loss of habitat, any kind of negative impacts on plants or wildlife, violations of any kind of regulatory requirements, or discharge of waste products would all fall under these environmental costs. An example would be if you have a sewer pipe that breaks and it causes sewage to enter a waterway or to flow onto a public or private land area, that would be potentially a significant environmental cost. The magnitude of these consequences have to be assessed in relative terms. Again, it's hard to put monetary value on these consequences. So a failure that resulted in a large quantity of raw sewage being discharged into a major waterway, that would be a very high consequence rating that you would want to give. On the other hand, if it would cause small amounts of sewage to be discharged onto maybe impervious surfaces, then that could be given a much lower rating. So it's all relative to each other. And then finally, we have these social consequences, which might not be at the forefront of a system's mind, but since it impacts your customers, you definitely want to think about it. And this would be social impacts could be impacting the general public, it could be impacting elected leaders, or it could be even impacting your own employees. Social consequences relate to safety, public health, traffic inconveniences, business disruptions, any kind of service outages that might be experienced, or even as small as limiting the public's ability to enjoy an open area or to enjoy a facility because of some problem with the system. In some cases, these impacts can be pretty minor. For example, if you have a 1 hour water outage in the middle of the day, or if there's a 2 hour blockage of one lane on a minor street to do some sort of fix. Those are pretty insignificant social consequences. But you can also have much greater social consequences, like much greater inconveniences to customers, which would be if you have very few isolation valves. So any kind of water line repair would require a large portion of the system to be shut down. That would be a much greater social consequence. In the first example that I gave, that 1 hour water outage, a simple repair in a residential area that shuts off water for just a few customers for a couple hours, that consequence is just, it's low. It's not as important. In the second case, when the whole system might be shut down to make a repair, that social consequence is much higher. So that's how you can rate social consequences relative to each other. Both of these examples focus on inconvenience, which might seem insignificant for those working at a water system, but to members of the community, that inconvenience may be extremely important and may impact how they feel about the system in general, which could have negative consequences for you in the future if you're trying to raise rates in the future and people have a negative perception or image of the system. That makes it a lot harder. Other consequential social costs include impacts to public health and safety. So again, think of the sinkhole example as a safety example, and that boil water advisory for Houston, that could be a public health example. But once you've evaluated all of the potential consequences, you're going to want to give an asset a consequence of failure rating, just like you did for probability of failure. But in this case, you're going to do it for consequence of failure. So this looks very similar to what you saw for probability of failure. Again, we have the 1 through 5 rating, and 1 being the extremely low consequence of failure, 5 being that extremely high consequence of failure. It's very generic, but for those of you who don't have any kind of consequence ranking system, this might be a good place to start. For those of you that already do, I would suggest making those descriptors a bit more defined, so that it's very easy for different people within the system to go through and understand what a 3 would look like in terms of consequences, or what a 1 would look like in terms of consequences. And from an implementation perspective, it's much easier to use the same scale for both your consequence of failure and your probability of failure ratings. So what I mean by that is, if a 1 to 5 scale was used for your probability of failure ratings, then systems should also use a 1 to 5 scale for the consequence of failure ratings. It's definitely not necessary to do it this way if you hate the idea or you already have another system, but I would suggest for those of you starting out, this would be easier to implement. So just like with probability of failure, you're going to want to assign a consequence of failure rating to each asset based on the potential consequences. Again, the asset should be ranked relative to each other, not any other system. And the goal is to determine which of your assets are more consequential upon failure than other assets in your system. So for example, to show how I would probably rate a 1 versus a 5, if you have a major distribution line that has the potential to cause major failures, have social and collateral damage, have legal consequences like the failure in Houston, and which is very expensive to repair, that is something that I would give a nice 5 rating on for the consequences. while an asset like a small valve that serves just a small residential area has a low cost of repair, essentially little to no social or environmental consequences, that one I would give a ranking of 1. So with that, let's do another quick poll. Again, these are just to make sure everyone's still engaged. And this one, just like with the probability of failure, is asking if you have any kind of consequence of failure rating in for your system. And that's something that's actually on paper that multiple people can use. So not just a rating system that's in your head. And we'll give everyone
And
a couple seconds.
my apologies, I left off the not applicable option on this one poll. So if it's not applicable to you, just say no. And
Yeah.
that's an okay response here. Sorry about that, guys.
That's okay. I gave Tess a little warning with that not applicable option. So please still participate if it's not applicable because we do need to monitor that participation for CEUs.
And as far as results, we have 6% that said yes, and everyone else was in the no camp.
Okay, got it. So and I don't think that's really surprising. Probability of failure is easier to have a rating system initially because you experience those failures and you're going out and you're seeing the condition of those assets. So I feel like that's a more natural system to put into place. And then when you think about consequences, that's something that you'd actually have to think about. You have to actually sit down and think about things that maybe have never happened before, but have the potential to happen. And you also have to look at the surrounding area. So that does take more time. But why we went so in depth into both probability of failure and consequence of failure, and why we would give each asset a rating for each one of those is so that we can calculate the criticality score of each asset. And the criticality score is found by multiplying the probability of failure ranking of that asset times the consequence of failure rating for that asset. And that's going to give you an overall criticality score. So for example, if you had an asset that had a probability of failure rating of 2 from that 1 to 5 scale that I showed you earlier, and an asset with a consequence of failure rating of 4, if you multiply those together, then that gives you 8. And that's your criticality score. And you'll want to do that for all the major assets in your system because this gives you a way to compare the criticality or the risk associated with all of those assets. And if this is sounding kind of fishy right now, or you're not exactly sure why you would put all that effort in, I'm going to go through a couple examples now that will hopefully convince you and show you why this would be a worthwhile exercise. So consider the following scenario. Say we have a 10-inch, or you have a 10-inch cast iron main pipe, and it was installed in 1958, and it has experienced numerous breaks in the past 5 years, and these breaks appear to be from degradation of the pipe. And you've also noticed that these breaks are occurring more frequently. The service area, it serves 3 residential subdivisions, so there are no commercial customers. It also has loop lines available in those areas, and it's not near any roadways like a highway that would be particularly difficult to work within. And additional information that you would want to know is that costs are not considered super high for this particular pipe to replace. So because of the asset, its remaining useful life based on its history and all of this, the service area and information surrounding it, I would give this pipe a probability of failure of 4 because from a 1 to 5 scale that we showed earlier. And that's because there have been multiple recent breaks and the break rate is increasing. And so that's a pretty good indication that you're going to see another break pretty soon in the future. And then I would give it a consequence of failure score of 2. And that's because while it's likely to fail in the future, there are loop lines, so there's some redundancy there, so the consequences wouldn't be as great. It's a moderate repair cost, so not super high, and it's not near any critical roadways, so doing any type of construction wouldn't be a huge consequence. So a POF of 4 and a COF of 2, we want to get the criticality score. So we're going to multiply them together. And you see here, this is a chart that we use and is available on our website. It's just another way to visualize multiplication, and you can download it if you think it would be helpful to you. But on the bottom, we have our probability of failure, and then on the left-hand side, our y-axis, we have the consequence of failure. So we want to multiply the two together. 2 times 4 equals 8. And so the criticality score for this asset is an 8. And that might not mean a ton to you at the moment. What does an 8 really mean? So we like to take it a step further and show it visually. And if you compare visually the different criticality scores, it can help you understand what an 8 means for your system. So we also
Haley,
have,
can we pause there for just a
oh,
second? Can you go back just
yes,
one slide? So we
one
have
more.
had a question come in when you were talking about the POF and multiplying it times the COF, and the question was, why do you multiply and not just add them? And part of the reasoning for that is what Haley's showing here. So Haley, I don't know if you wanna address this or if you want me to just go ahead.
You can go ahead, Don.
All right. So when we look at comparing assets and ranking assets and figuring out where we're going to invest our limited dollars, which is where Haley's taking us, this ability to plot consequence versus probability really becomes beneficial. So this multiplication follows that ability to graph it very simply, to use a table like this very simply. It also allows you to kind of diversify risk a little bit more, so that there's a wider range of numbers, because if your top is 5 and 5, you only get to a 10. So if you've got thousands of assets and the highest score they can get is a 10, that could really make it difficult to tell which assets fall in which categories of risk. So this is the beginning of the answer. So I wanted you to take a look at this graph and think about, or this table, and kind of think about how you're multiplying and why you're multiplying. And then as Haley continues to explain this visualization and comparison, that will help to probably address the question of why you would prefer to multiply and not add them.
Yes, I would agree with that, Dawn. And I think it'll make even more sense when you see the criticality scores plotted on the matrix that I'm going to show you right now, why we want some higher numbers to be available for your criticality scores. So here's a matrix that we have, again, on our website, free to download, that has the probability of failure, again, on that x-axis below, and then the consequence of failure on the y on the left-hand side. And you see in that bottom left-hand corner, those are where you're going to find your low risk assets in green. And then you're going to have your moderate risk assets that are going to be in the yellow orange area. And then your higher risk assets are going to be in that upper right area. And this is a great way to help people understand the severity of various risk scores. So let's take that example of the pipe and the criticality score of 8. So if I then number my axes and plot an 8, you'll see that it's falling in that sort of yellowish orange area, which then tells me, or tells the folks that maybe I'm trying to convince or I'm presenting to, that this asset is moderate risk because it falls in this area. And if you plotted, which I'll show you in a minute, several different assets on the same graph, then you'd visually be able to show your stakeholders, hey, I'm applying for funding or I need funding for this asset because it's falling in that red area, which means that it's likely going to fail. And when it does, those consequences are not going to be good. So bear with me. I'm going to go into examples that show you where how plotting assets on graphs like this can then help you make and drive decisions for your system. So you can use these criticality scores specifically when you put them on graphs like the one that you see in the background here to drive decision making, and especially when you're going and reporting to a board or talking to customers, it's a great tool. It can help you decide which assets you might want to run to failure versus which assets are worth doing that rare replace early versus which assets you should do preventative maintenance for or monitoring for potential failure, etc. So let's start out with just looking at it here. Again, the chart's a little bit bigger here, but we still have that probability of failure on the x-axis and the consequence of failure on the y-axis. And all of these blue dots that you're now seeing on the chart are representing several different assets. So it's just an example. The chart doesn't always have to look like this, but these are just pretend assets that have been assigned criticality scores and plotted on the graph here. And you can use this risk chart for just one class of assets. So sticking with the hydrant example, you could just put all of your hydrants on the graph and see which ones fall into that high risk area versus low risk area, or you could use the chart and put all of your assets on it depending on the size of your system and the information that you want to get out of it. But if we go through each portion of the chart, you'll see how it can help you make decisions based on how critical your assets are. So here on the bottom left, we have our assets that have a low probability of failure and a low consequence of failure. And because of that, their criticality score is considered in the quote unquote low risk area, that green area. And these assets in the green should be your lowest priority, and staff should perform only the necessary O&M to maintain performance. So only the bare minimum routine maintenance. And this is because spending in this portion of the criticality matrix will not reduce your overall risk profile because they're already relatively low risk. So where you're going to want to spend the majority of your money is in that upper right-hand quadrant, or even that moderate area if you have additional resources, because that could drastically change your overall risk profile. If you're reducing the probability of failure in that red area or in that yellow area, then you could potentially move those assets from the red and yellow area into the yellow or green area, and that would change your risk profile. But if you're spending a lot of money on assets in this green area, then you're just moving them maybe slightly more to darker green, and you're making them just slightly lower risk when they were already low risk. So it's a great way to visualize where the majority of your assets are within a chart. Then if we move on and look at the assets that, again, still that low consequence of failure, but we have a range of probability of failure in this section that's circled, you could use the run to failure management strategy. And this management strategy is acceptable here because if assets in this area fail, the consequences are very low. And this management style requires a system to be prepared to take action when the asset does fail because you are deciding to let it to fail. And this could be perhaps by having spare parts on hand, or maybe ensuring that a specific staff member is trained properly to do that replacement, but it does not require taking action prior to that, to failure, because the consequences are so low. So you could decide, okay, all of my assets that fall into this area, I'm just going to decide to do routine maintenance, but allow them to run to failure. I'm not going to put too much effort into any other kind of intervention. Alternatively, you have assets that fall into this area of the graph, the moderate risk area, that are also in that higher consequence area. And these assets you'll want to monitor to determine when the probability of failure increases or when a potential failure may occur. And these assets are really good candidates for predictive or routine maintenance. If monitoring shows potential failures occurring, then preventive maintenance should take place to prevent the functional failure. And if monitoring shows that the assets are becoming more likely to fail, then of course their criticality is going to increase. So that means that they're going to move further up into that orangish, reddish area. And at that point, that's when you start to think about, maybe I'm going to replace that asset early because the consequences of failure could be so severe that I would do that trade-off. Alternatively, you then have this section where it's still moderate risk, so it's still that yellow and orange area, but you're in a lower consequence bracket. And these are assets that, again, as I mentioned before, you could decide to run to failure because the consequences are so low. So even though the color is a little bit scary, it's that orange, yellow, moderate risk, you could still choose to make that management decision, but you'll also want to do routine maintenance and probably more preventative maintenance in this area because the risk, or the criticality score is a little bit higher here. And then finally, we have this nice red area, the danger zone that nobody wants their assets to be in, and that's those assets that have a very high probability of failure and also a very high consequence if failure does occur. And assets in this area, you're not only going to want to do routine maintenance, but you're also want to do preventative or predictive maintenance until a replacement can be scheduled. These are the assets that you want to target for early replacement or rehabilitation prior to the asset failing. So if you're going to your board or stakeholders, you can show them on this graph, hey, these are the assets in the danger zone that I'm going to need money for in the next X amount of time to replace eventually, because it's not going to be good if something happens to these. And that's where your data-driven decision making comes with criticality. You'll want to start first by spending your resources, your time in that upper right-hand quadrant, and then disperse diagonally from there, depending how much is left. So once you address those high criticality assets, then you'll move into that orange yellow area. And again, money resources in this lower left-hand corner is not going to drive down your risk much. So you're just going to want to do routine maintenance and really minimize the expenditure in this area. So this matrix makes it really easy to compare assets and to determine which of the assets are the most critical. It's also a useful tool for communicating asset risk to board members, to community members, to each other, anybody who may not understand what a particular criticality score actually means, because it's one thing to calculate your criticality score, it's another to go tell somebody, hey, my hydrant is a 15. What does that mean to them? This is a great way to show it. Oh, I'm sorry, it was not moving. I apologize, everybody. Okay, here we are. So let's go to a quick poll here. This is one about communication. So it's very specific. I'm not sure if there's a not applicable one here, Tess, but do you communicate risk to your board is the question. So some of you might not have a board, which is obviously go ahead and click not applicable. But for those of you that do, is there any way that you are communicating the risk associated with your asset to board members?
Awesome. And Haley, just letting you know, we do have the NA option. And it looks like we have almost full participation now. That was a quick one for folks. So I'm going to close this poll in 3, 2, 1. And as far as our results, we have 44% of folks saying yes, they do communicate risk to their boards. We do have 11% of folks that said no, and then about 17% of people do not have a board. So it would be not relevant to those folks.
Okay. Well, great. That's a higher number than we've seen in the past that communicates risk to their board. So that's nice to see. And if you've had any challenges with that in the past and feel like a visual would be helpful, please feel free to go to our website and download that chart, and you can plot some of your assets there to help them understand if they're not completely familiar with it. So with that, the good news is that there is a way to reduce your criticality score, to reduce risk. There are actually several ways that are shown on the screen here. So you're not necessarily stuck with the criticality score that you assign your assets. There are numerous avenues that you can go down to try to reduce the risk of failure or reduce the consequences of failure, which would then ultimately reduce your overall criticality score. The first would be preventive and routine maintenance, which I mentioned a lot when showing those graphs. This will obviously reduce the likelihood of asset failure. And when I was talking about routine maintenance, what I meant was anything that's regularly scheduled. So anything that's based on a calendar or based on a use-based schedule. So say every month or every 1,000 hours of runtime, something like this. And this kind of maintenance would be like lubricating a pump once a year or operating a valve every year, something like that. And then by preventative maintenance, that's a bit trickier because that's conducted to maintain operating condition and to slow deterioration and prevent failure. So you're kind of guessing when you think failure would occur and then doing preventative maintenance a little bit before that. So preventative maintenance would require monitoring and a pretty thorough understanding of an asset's condition. And that's why it would apply to those higher risk assets that were in the red or in the orange, because it just takes more effort. That brings us to monitoring, regular monitoring, like visual inspections of your facilities or equipment measurements, like reading your meters or checking the water levels in your wells. That ensures that your assets are operating properly. And so it's going to help staff identify any kind of problems earlier, such as potential failures. And so they can act quickly. So that reduces likelihood of failure because you can hopefully catch it and intervene sooner, which then ultimately reduces your criticality score. Then we have spare parts. I'm sure many of you who've worked with a system have experienced the unavailability of the right parts at the right time and how it can have some serious impacts, especially on water quality, or could cause environmental hazards or even create hazards for your own staff. So having spare parts will greatly reduce downtime, and it cuts the delay when parts are not locally or readily available. So that reduces your consequence of failure because you can get an asset up and running again pretty quickly with a spare asset. So if you reduce your consequence, that reduces your overall criticality. And spare parts are really important for, we work with some systems in US territories. Most of them are on islands. Obviously, to get any kind of part to an island in a timely manner, that just doesn't exist. So spare part inventories are pretty critical to them. The downside of spare parts is that it's expensive to just have a spare part sitting somewhere, but costs can be minimized if you really think about which assets are in that red area that it would be critical to have a spare part for. Then we have another way to reduce your criticality scores would be to have specialized training. You might need specialized training to do a repair properly or maintain something properly. So specialized training can be used to reduce your probability of failure, which then reduces your criticality score. And then we have replacing assets early. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's pretty challenging to know when to replace an asset right before it fails. So if you're replacing an asset, you're probably replacing it early. If you're doing it before it fails, you'll want to do these again for those assets that fall in that red high critical area. And you won't want to do it fairly often because it's just another expense. You're choosing to give up some useful life to prevent some sort of potentially catastrophic failure. And then finally, we have redundancy, and I want to go into redundancy a little bit more because this brings in the intermediate side of asset management here, because redundancy can be built into the criticality equation, so it can make it a little bit more complicated for those folks who are a little bit more advanced at asset management. So redundancy is a great risk reduction strategy. If you think about airplanes, there's a super high consequence if there's any kind of failure for airplanes. So they have a ton of redundancy built in. They have that checklist that pilots go through, and they're able to fly with one engine because of redundancy. So all the redundancy that's built into an airplane reduces the risk, and redundancy for water systems is a little bit less involved, but it involves the duplicate assets in critical areas in order to provide a backup in case there is a failure. And it also provides that operational flexibility during day-to-day operations. So if an asset fails, then there's another asset that can operate in its place without causing any kind of downtime. So for example, if there are 3 pumps available and only 2 are needed to meet the demand, and one of those 2 pumps fails, then you have a standby pump that will start, so the demand will still be met. That's redundancy. That's going to significantly reduce your criticality. And so, as I mentioned, it can be incorporated into your criticality equation in 2 ways. The first, I think, is the easiest, and the one that I would definitely suggest for people who are just starting out, and that's to build redundancy into your consequence of failure score. So if you have partial or total redundancy, then you can let that impact what your COF ranking is for a specific asset. So if the asset would normally have a consequence of failure score without redundancy of 5, and say you add redundancy, even partial, then you could move that consequence of failure score down to potentially a 2. And so that's one way that it could impact your criticality score. The other way is to multiply the redundancy factor by the criticality score. And this is what it would look like. It would take that probability of failure times the consequence and multiply it by 1 minus the redundancy factor as a decimal. And it's as a decimal because we usually think of redundancy in terms of percentages. So if we stick with that 3 pump example, if you only need 2 pumps to operate at a time and the system has 3, so you have that extra pump and that pump fails, and you put that 3rd pump in to replace that 2nd pump that had failed, that's a 50% redundancy because you need 2 pumps and you have one that can replace one of the 2 if it fails. So that's 50% redundancy. And if you do it in decimal form, that means 0.5. So let's do a little example to help you understand that. If you look at the following scenario here, again, our asset is going to be the pump. It's the same example. You have 3, you only need 2 to operate. It's failed multiple times recently, so let's give it a POF of 4. A portion of the town is not receiving water if both pumps aren't working. So if one fails, that's a pretty high consequence. Let's give it a 4. We're not considering redundancy in that 4 ranking. Then if you look at redundancy, because there are 3 pumps, 2 are in use, you have one that can replace one of those pumps, that's a 50% redundancy. So if we put that all together, we have a POF of 4 times a COF of 4 times 1 minus that redundancy factor in decimal form, so 0.5, which means altogether 4 times 0.5, that gives you a criticality score of 8. If you took out that redundancy, it would be 4 times 4, and that gives you a criticality score of 16, which is obviously a much greater score than age. So that shows you how redundancy can reduce criticality. Again, you do not need to do it this way. If it seems a bit too complicated, feel free to just include redundancy in that consequence of failure rating. Okay, the last section is visualizing data in another way. So not just the matrix that I showed you earlier, but this time in a graph of how you can visualize probability of failure and consequence of failure that can help you understand where your problem areas are and also be used as a communication tool. So for those of you that were on last week, these pictures might be familiar. James presented them. This is a city's water distribution pipelines based on as-built. They had some break data that was in tabular format, but they didn't have anything digitally, but they did know that their distribution pipes were all about 75 to 100 years old. So just based on age, there was no way for them to really figure out how to prioritize pipe replacement. And even though they had the break data, because it was in tabular format, it was just really hard to sift through and see. And so what a couple people at our center were able to do was take that break data and those as-built and put it into a GIS system. And here you can see that the blue are all pipe that have pretty few breaks. And then once again, the yellow, orange, and red, all of those colors, and then the corresponding larger numbers are associated with more pipe or more breaks per pipe. So I want you to focus on this area here, especially this area and this area. So all of those are greater, have more pipe breaks than other areas. So they found that their system was actually in much better shape than what they expected just based on age, which is why we look at useful life and not age. And they were able to identify that, okay, I see that these areas have had multiple pipe breaks. I'm going to assume that the probability of failure in these areas is going to be pretty high going into the future. And if we just take one of those sections and zoom in a little bit, this is an area that had a lot of breaks. So each one of those dots, you have some break data. It also shows you the date that those breaks occurred. And by doing that, they found that time matters. So if you zoom in a little bit, it shows that the number of breaks in this troubled area is increasing from 1 every 2 years in the early 2000s to 3 a year in 2016. And again, this was another problem area that's showing 23 breaks within 14 years in that upper right-hand corner area. So that's clearly one that they're going to need to replace, and that you could even take this kind of information further and add something like per mile costing information to enable the city to develop even a better, more robust capital improvement plan. But using the GIS, they were able to see with the break data which areas were going to be high probability of failure areas in the future. That was considering consequence as just the same for all of those areas. So they wanted to replace them pipe, and they were just looking at probability of failure. But you should definitely also add consequence of failure. And you can do so here. So instead of these numbers being probability of failure, they're consequence of failure, and they're rankings, that 1 through 5 ranking. And as you can see, we have just one area that's a 5, but we have multiple areas that are, excuse me, these are still POF rankings, I apologize. So probability of failure of 5 in one area, so you know you're going to want to pay attention to it. But then you had 3 other areas that had a probability of failure of 4, those orange areas. But if you're a system and you have limited resources, you can't necessarily put those resources to all 3 of those POF 4s. So how do you decide which one you're going to prioritize if you can only prioritize one segment? And that would be looking at the consequences. So here we've determined at the bottom, it's a residential area that has the probability of 4. And then at the top left, you have probability of 4, but it's going to impact not just a residential area, but also a school. So if I was going to rank then the consequence of failure of these areas, I would rank that bottom pipe a 2 because it's just impacting a residential area. And I would rank that top one a 4 because it's impacting residential and a school. And because there's a school, there's probably a good amount of traffic in that area, which means any kind of repair that would be needed if there was failure would be pretty disruptive. So here's a way
Haley,
to...
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second here.
Yes.
We have someone that says they lost audio. I'm obviously still receiving it. Wanted to check with Tess. And if anyone else has the ability to just put into the question box yes or no. I mean, I guess if you can't hear me, you can't say yes, you lost audio. But if you're still hearing, if you could state it.
Yeah, I'm still hearing pretty well, and I'm seeing that most people on are responding they can hear.
Okay.
So let's help our other attendee that lost audio offline, and you can continue, Haley. We'll get her back on.
Okay. Well, no, this is a perfect pause because this is our last poll question. So the last one is, do you communicate risk to your stakeholders? So before it was a bit more specific about board members, but stakeholders in this case could mean your community, it could mean your elected leaders, anybody that is adjacent or interacts with your system or the services that you provide. And again, last one. Okay, looks like it's closed.
I left it open just for one more second here, and I'm going to close it now.
Thank you.
And as far as our results go, we have about 40% of folks saying yes, 17% said no on communicating risk.
Okay, well, I would highly recommend it. We've shown you a couple ways today. You can do it with your GIS system. You can do it with plotting some criticality scores on charts, but any way that you choose to do it, I think it's very important to keep that line of communication open to all of your stakeholders. And if they don't understand, then I would suggest trying different mediums to figure out the best way to communicate that information. So the very last part is all about how criticality, just like condition, changes, and it changes slightly every day. Of course, you're not going to go reassess criticality every day or even every month, but you should do it annually if possible, and also when there are any major changes. That could mean upgrades, replacement, any kind of major construction, rehabilitation, or if any sort of redundancy is added, all of that's going to change criticality scores for your assets. So go ahead and reassess them annually, or if any of those big changes do occur. Okay, we're coming to the very end, and this review is short, but it'll be very helpful for those of you who are taking the assessment at the end of this presentation. So the overall objective, again, of criticality in this section is for projects and activities to be prioritized based on criticality scores, based on risk, to ensure limited financial and personnel resources are used efficiently. There are, as a reminder, 4 failure modes: mortality, level of service, capacity, and financial inefficiency. Even though most people think of mortality, please consider all 4. To calculate the criticality score for an asset, you want to take your probability of failure rating for that asset and multiply it by the consequence of failure rating for that asset. That will give you that overall criticality score. Criticality is not all bad. You can reduce your criticality score, you can reduce your risk, and that is through redundancy, making sure you're doing your routine and preventative maintenance, making sure you have training for those that need training, making sure you're doing monitoring. All of that is going to reduce your criticality score. And then finally, as I mentioned a second ago, criticality changes. It changes every day, just like condition changes every day. So please reevaluate your criticality scores annually, or if something significant happens to an asset like redundancy or an upgrade or construction. So with that, here is my contact information. Thank you for sticking with us for an hour and a half. I know that that is a long time to sit in front of the computer, so I hope that you are stretching now. And Dawn, I don't know if there are any specific questions. We're down to the wire with time, but if we can't get to any of your questions, I will happily email you answers or provide any resources.
You're in good shape.
Okay, well, I'm going to take that as you guys understood everything and you're going to take it home to your system and go create some POF and COF ranking systems after this.
Haley, before we conclude, I'll just remind folks that for those of you interested in the continuing education certificate, the quiz will pop up after you close out of the webinar program in your browser. And it is also included as a link in a follow-up email that gets sent out an hour after the conclusion of the webinar. In that follow-up email, it says take the survey, and you need to click the link under there. That includes quiz questions. And lastly, please remember that all the slides are available under handouts, and you're very welcome to download those and use those as you need, especially if you're taking the quiz. Kaylee, do you have any last thoughts before we wrap up?
No, just thanks everyone for coming, and we have one more session next week on life cycle costing.
Wonderful. Thanks, Haley and Dawn, and thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.